Good afternoon. It's Tuesday, the 24th of July, 2018, just after 1 o'clock. Welcome to UK Column News. Your host today, Mike Robinson, myself, Brian Gerrish.
Well, yesterday we were talking about the white helmets, Brian, and the response has been typically hysterical. This is typical of what's been going out. Here are some of the most influential accounts tweeting about the white helmets on Sunday, who is right in the centre of it, but Vanessa Beeley in this heat map here highlighted. This clearly has been a problem for some, that so many what are being described on Twitter as pro-Russian influencers are getting involved in this discussion over who the white helmets are, what they represent. But nonetheless, the message from the Foreign Office yesterday was that these people have been evacuated through Israel into Jordan, from where they will be sent to their homes internationally, their new homes in the UK and Canada and Germany and other places. It falls into this narrative, doesn't it? Because this is Voice of Europe, and the headline here is, while Tommy Robinson is jailed, 90% of returning jihadists walk free. And they're saying, while Tommy Robinson is in jail for reporting on the Muslim rape gangs that our government is hoping to hide from the public, just 40 of the 400 or more jihadist fighters thought to have been returned to the UK have been successfully prosecuted. Many have been given council houses and are free to roam our streets. It has been disclosed. Who disclosed it? Well, it was the Daily Mail. Here's the Mail article. Jihadis free to roam in the UK. Concerns over tracking dangerous extremists, as only 40 out of 400 British fanatics returning from Syria and Iraq have been prosecuted. They go on to say that Security Minister Ben Wallace revealed the figures, as there's apparently not enough evidence to convict most of the jihadis returning to the UK. It was Labour MP John Woodcock who asked the question, and he said it's no wonder the government tried to keep secret that it has only managed to prosecute 1 in 10 of the British jihadis returning from Syria. It is an affront to our country that the difficulty of amassing admissible evidence means there's no comeuppance for people who went to aid an evil regime that wanted to slaughter British civilians. Okay, well, I'm not quite sure about that. But anyway, the point here is the narrative is that jihadis roaming the streets, this reinforces the idea that every time we look round, we're facing enemy combatants on our streets. And of course, we've got to remember that no matter what is said in this article, of course, the security services know who these people are. We'll be coming on to the use of investigatory powers later on in the programme. So they know who these people are. They could solve this problem very quickly. But what's the effect of this? Well, we continue to see a rise in the number of Islamic attacks on Islamic communities beyond the incident. This is the government promoting this report. Beyond the incident, the outcomes for victims of anti-Muslim prejudice. This is the government saying this. Once again, Tel Mama have reported their highest number of anti-Muslim incidents in 2017. Your report shows abusive behaviour and physical attacks remain the two most common forms of Islamophobic incident reported. It goes on to say, your report also highlights the majority of anti-Muslim hatred is directed at Muslim women, and that their visibility can be a factor for this. Over 50% of reported incidents featured a visibly Muslim woman as the victim. And it said, we need to do more than ensure that British Muslims feel safe as they go about their lives as much as anyone else. It also shows growing concern online, with 60% rise in reports of Islamophobia online. And the point here, Brian, is that this whole angst with Tommy Robinson, the angst over Islamophobia, is being generated by the British government through its policy and through its actions. And I just want to say once again that we're making a big mistake if we fall for it.
Without question. I'll just come back because I wasn't here yesterday. But for me, when I saw the report on the white helmets, I thought how remarkable that if these people had been doing all the good works which the British government and others claim, surely the community in Syria is going to say to them, stay, we're going to look after you, we're going to reward you for all your good work. So the two things don't fit. Suddenly we've got to remove these people from the country because what? Because they didn't do what they said they do, and the population at large knows it.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. But
Okay.
I totally agree. Sorry, Mike, I agree with your analysis there. What we have got is the British government stoking up both sides in order to get that violence, the long hot summer and the violence. If that occurs, then of course the British state can bring in emergency powers, and we will have full lockdown. So that's clearly, that's clearly the game.
Okay. In the meantime, modern slavery, one of the larger sources of immigration into this country, people trafficking and modern slavery. John Lewis Partnership, according to this article in the Co-op News, John Lewis Partnership joins Bright Future programme to tackle modern slavery. Is that what they're doing? Are they going to tackle it? Well, Victoria Atkins, who is the Minister for Crime, Safeguarding and Vulnerability, was meeting with some of what were being described as the most influential business leaders in the UK, including chief executives from Aviva, Co-op, Associated British Foods, BT, Sky, and now John Lewis as well. And they were joining with government representatives at the Business Against Slavery Forum to discuss what more can be done to accelerate progress in tackling modern slavery. Victoria Atkins had said this government is proud to lead the world in ending this terrible injustice through the Modern Slavery Act and an advanced law enforcement response. However, we know that hidden from view in the supply chains that produce the goods and services we consume, there's an underbelly of forced labour that we must eradicate. Okay, let's just remind ourselves of the scale of this. We've shown this a number of times. £130 billion every year profit made from human traffickers, from the human trafficking trade, and from modern slavery. Much of that is sexual exploitation. Much of it is 54%, 38% into forced labour, 8% into others. There's 21 million victims worldwide. And I just want to remind everybody once again of what the government response to this situation is. Remember, it's £130 billion profit. That's not turnover, that's profit. Well, here is the graph showing the profit on the left. On the right-hand side is the government prevention funding. So we've got £130 billion profit made, £150 million, not billion, million pounds put into prevention. Clearly, that is not going to have any effect. Is the Business Against Slavery Forum going to have any major effect? Well, the combined turnover, not profit, but turnover of these companies that are involved in this is quite similar to the profit that's being made from modern slavery. So even if they were to apply all their profits into solving this problem, it still wouldn't be enough probably to solve the problem. So, you know, there's bigger issues at stake here, but policy is the biggest problem. And of course, a forum, a discussion group isn't going to solve this problem. I applaud what these companies are doing, actually, because, you know, they are attempting to provide employment for people that have been taken out of modern slavery. And I think that's a laudable thing, but at the end of the day, it's not going to solve the problem. Whereas government policy, or perhaps some criticism by these companies of government policy, some honest criticism, might go some way to changing the situation.
Could do, Mike. We need to remember, of course, that wars help that slavery and the trafficking of people, and UK particularly good at helping to stoke up those overseas wars. But at the same time, we've got a little bit of trouble with the shortage of money, and that's got some implications. So thank you very much to the person that sent this letter through to us. Can we pop this one?
Sorry.
Just pop this one on screen. Basically, this is a response by the Ministry of Defence Procurement, Mr. Beeb or Bebb, Guto Bebb, to the Right Honourable Dr. Julian Lewis MP, and it's to do with spare parts going to Oman. So if we just have a look at this, if we can, in a bit more detail on screen. It says, Dear Julian, thank you for your letter of 18th June 2018 raising your concern about Challenger 2 sustainability following the written ministerial statement of the 16th of May 2018, which detailed the UK's recent grant in kind of spares to the Sultanate of Oman. I'm replying on behalf of the Secretary of State for Defence as this issue falls within my portfolio. I can confirm that the British Army's own requirements were indeed considered before the grant in aid was authorised. On examination of this request, the Army concluded that these spares were surplus to requirement and that granting them to Oman would not affect the operational capability of the Army. Although you're correct that the modernising defence programme is still ongoing and therefore capability decisions are yet to be confirmed, the Army is confident both that current fleet size is sufficient to ensure the Army is able to meet the challenges asked of it, and the existing spare pool far exceeds the Army's own requirements. So there we are. We've got a lot of things to give away to Oman, but there's so much in this particular letter that is not said. Particularly when we look at that very last bit there where it says that the spares pool far exceeds the Army's own requirements. Why should that be? Well, if we go back in time, this is back to August 2014, we can see the Independent giving us a little bit of a highlight. British Army reduced to one single tank regiment. The Ministry of Defence says that they will keep a number of tanks in storage and will be able to regenerate if needed. So let's have a look at the figures over the top of that. Thanks to the Independent here. In 1990, there were 4 tank regiments in the British Army, which had at their disposal nearly 800 tanks. Now the British Army can call on just 156 tanks, with 56 of them belonging to the newly formed Royal Tank Regiment. So the reason we got so many spares, it would appear, is because we don't have many tanks left. And we can add a bit of meat onto the bones of this because we've got a Freedom of Information response from the Ministry of Defence where somebody's asked them about the number of Challenger 2 tanks. And if I just expand that on screen for you, this is the response. A search for the information has now been completed within the Ministry of Defence, and I can confirm that information in scope of your request is held. The information requested is as follows: 386 Challenger 2 tanks and 22 driver training tanks based on the Challenger 2 chassis were originally ordered. And then it goes on to say this, and this is really wonderful language: 227 Challenger 2 tanks and the 22 driver training tanks remain in service with the British Army. All of the Challenger 2 tanks will be available for operational use if required. However, it may help if I explain the Army manages its vehicle fleets under the current fleet management model. The Army uses a 4-element approach. The first element of this model provides a limited number of permanently issued equipment for low-level training and competency. The second provides a training fleet to enable units to train together. This includes permanently issued equipment to training areas such as British Army Training Unit in Canada. The third element provides equipment for deployment and contingency operations. And the fourth acts as a buffer, which enables the Army to sustain the first 3 elements as equipment enters deep maintenance or is damaged beyond repair. So I've read that little paragraph several times, trying to actually work out how many operational tanks the British Army has got, and I cannot quite get an answer. But I think I get the impression that we've woefully too few tanks, and even the ones we've got are deployed for training, some of them in Canada, so those are not readily available. But the Ministry of Defence clearly fudging the figures there because we don't want to be talking about the fact we really don't have a proper tank army. But if that's bad, then have a look at this, which is an absolute classic. We've got the MOD spending 10.5 billion on a fleet of jets, which are supposed to be able to transport British troops to military bases around the world. These are 14 Airbus A330s, and they're part of a controversial leasing agreement which costs about 400 million a year. But the deal with a consortium of aviation manufacturers called Airtanker allows the commercial group to potentially make millions more by renting up to 4 of the unused aircraft to holiday firms. So this organisation, Mike, is making a packet out of the public via the Ministry of Defence, And then it makes a double packet by saying, well, the Ministry of Defence is not using these aircraft, so we're going to rent them out for tourists. And the Mail article says, and we were lucky enough to be able to go on one of the flights. Thomas Cook is providing flights to fly thousands of tourists to Mallorca, Tenerife, New York and Florida, all via the Ministry of Defence equipment. Well, who is going to sort this out? Gets a bit woolly. Tank shortage, sorry I'm busy being a celebrity right now. Who does this refer to? Well, it's none other than local MP Johnny Mercer, ex-serviceman, apparently ex-champion for the forces, but he's playing celebrity at the moment by going missing, and we've all got to try and find out where he is, Mike.
Might be better if he stayed missing.
It could well be a lot better. But this is the state of Conservative government in UK in 2018. And let's remember that statement by MP Nick Bowles, Conservative MP, who talked about a period of creative destruction in public services. Welcome to that phase, because we can see it in front of our own eyes.
Right, just before we move on to the next little bit, apologies for the people watching the live stream. There was a technical problem with that for the first 5 or 10 minutes of that, but it's up and running now, as you'll have noticed. Sorry about that. You can watch the first part of the programme on the archive shortly. Now, staying with defence for a second, the concern that has been expressed by Brian over the last couple of weeks has, with regard to Rolls-Royce, for example, is the potential that technology which might be considered national security related technology is being sent abroad through mergers and acquisitions and other stuff. The government has just announced new security investment powers, national security investment powers, as they're describing them. So the Business Secretary has produced a white paper, here it is, entitled National Security and Investment, and it's all about the Department for Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy delivering an update to existing powers which allow ministers to screen certain mergers for public interest reasons.
I think there might be a mic problem, Mike.
Right, okay, so there we go. If approved, basically this is a consultation that's begun, so if approved, the government will call in transactions, as they describe it, that give rise to national security risks for further assessment. So here's what they're saying. The government will reform its powers to protect national security from hostile actors using ownership or influence over business and assets to harm the country. The reforms will be proportionate and focused in their application, and each case following a clear and predictable process. Now the question is, what's the definition of hostile actor in this case?
Anybody that the government deems, Mike, I would assume.
Well, yes, but they seem to switch that on and off as they see fit, don't they?
Of course.
And that's the key thing. Right, we mentioned investigatory powers earlier on, and the government has released its transparency report on the use of disruptive and investigatory powers. This is fantastic. It sets out the way in which disruptive and investigatory powers have been used by the security and intelligence agencies, as well as law enforcement, to tackle the threats posed by terrorism, organised crime and hostile state activity. They say that there have been 5 terrorist attacks in the UK since the publication of the second transparency report in February 2017, and the latest iteration shows a clear increase in the use of certain disruptive and investigatory powers. As with the previous iterations, the report brings together and gives a detailed explanation, they say, of various disruptive and investigatory powers, such as stops and searches under the Terrorism Act and prescription of terrorist organisations. It also provides extensive statistical information relating to those powers and how they've been used. So what did Ben Wallace have to say? He said that the spate of terrorist attacks last year and the nerve agent attack earlier this year were a stark reminder of the real and significant threat this country faces from terrorism and hostile states. Now, that's fine. They've been using these powers. They're going to use these powers where it is proportionate and necessary to do so. Let's just remind ourselves that they said that. The government will seek to use the full range of capabilities where it's proportionate and necessary to do so. My question is, who decides what is proportionate and necessary? Well, of course they do. and that they are supposed to be held to account for that by the Investigatory Powers Tribunal. Well, let's have a look at the successes then of the Investigatory Powers Tribunal and see how many cases that they have heard that have actually resulted in some kind of result. And in fact, not very many. So 52% of the cases brought before the Investigatory Powers Tribunal were considered to be frivolous or vexatious. 25% there was no determination made on the legality or otherwise of the activities of security services and others. And 11% was out of jurisdiction, or it was withdrawn, or it was not a valid case. 7% of the cases found in favour of the person bringing the allegations, and 5% were considered to be out of time, whatever that means. That, I guess, means well, we found an excuse not to hear this case. So the question is, would the Investigatory Powers Tribunal be independent, or would it not? Would it do a decent job, or would it not? Well, I think the Register article from yesterday, the headline being UK spies broke law for 15 years, but what can you do? Shrugs judge, says it all. So this is the Investigatory Powers Tribunal. And the article says that the Investigatory Powers Tribunal has re-ruled that GCHQ, MI5 and MI6 engaged in indiscriminate and illegal bulk cable tapping surveillance for 15 years and has once again refused to do anything about it. So they released a 113 paragraph judgment, which was handed down yesterday. And it was filled, the Register says, with assurances that were anxious to assist in achieving improvements in spying practices. The president of the Investigatory Powers Tribunal, Sir Michael Burton, found that for a decade and a half, the spy agencies were operating outside of Section 94 of the UK's 1984 Telecommunications Act. But then he said that there had been over those 15 years, there had been an unlawful delegation of the power conferred by Section 94 from the Foreign Secretary to the agencies. But then he went on to say that the Foreign Secretary had from 2010 imposed a requirement that any variation in the scope of data to be provided under a direction required his approval. And then by 2015, that there was in substance no delegation of power from the Foreign Secretary. So what he said was, what he's basically saying there is that William Hague, who was Foreign Secretary from 2010, and then Philip Hammond, who became Foreign Secretary in 2014, that they had effectively shut down this illegal activity from 2010 onwards. Well, 2010 to a certain point, but certainly from 2014, certainly from 2015. And therefore, he doesn't need to worry about it anymore. It doesn't matter that they were acting illegally for 15 years. There's no need for him to do anything about that because it was sorted out.
Of course, he uses that expression, Mike, operating outside, what was it, Section 94 of the UK's 1984 Telecommunications Act, breaking the law.
Yes.
That's what they were doing. They were breaking the law, but we don't even describe it as that. They were acting outside of, which probably brings us nicely to this statement, which I'm going to justify with our report on child abuse. But the UK Conservative government is now clearly operating beyond authority. We have a cabal running the country. Even backbench MPs have no idea what's happening in Westminster. So it is simply the members of the Cabinet Office and the secretive Pearl Office, which is dealing with the global corporations and the international banks with connections through to the Privy Council. And this is all secret, certainly to other members of Parliament, but also to the public. So we have a cabal, many people would say a criminal cabal running the country. Let's remember that the fuel for UK politics is the abuse of children. Just an amazing headline here from the Daily Mail a few days ago. Forget the bit about the drink-sodden world of EU boss sneering at Britain. What we're really looking at is the main headline, what a cosy cover-up. And basically this was pointing out that MPs had voted for anonymity if they're accused of sexual harassment and if there's any hint of expenses fraud. And what the Daily Mail article pointed out was that minutes after this vote was taken, a list of politicians under investigation vanished from Parliament's website. Now, I found this particularly interesting because a few weeks ago we actually made contact with the Parliamentary Standards Commissioner's office to ask some questions about Mr. Keith Vaz. But on that particular day back in June, I think it was the 22nd of June, what we established was that this lady, where are we? Catherine Hudson was going to step down as the Parliamentary Standards Commissioner, and we were intrigued to see that she was going to be replaced by a new lady. This is Catherine Stone, and her background is looking after children with special needs before becoming a qualified child protection social worker and mental health expert. And this just seemed a fascinating qualification to then move over to be Parliamentary Standards Commissioner. It just seems a little bit too interesting. Well, at the time, that's right, the 22nd of June, we had a look at the Parliamentary Standards web page, and one of the things we could see here was allegations under investigation by the Commissioner. We were interested in Mr. Vaz, and apparently the Vaz inquiry is confidential. That's what we were told. No information can be disclosed to the public in the interests of fairness. That is clearly fair to Mr. Vaz. I don't think it's particularly fair to the public, but of course the public doesn't count. We were told that no comment can be made on whether the video of Mr. Vaz forms the base of evidence. This is the video which appeared to show him in a room with some rent boys, and there was a discussion of drugs. The inquiry, even though there was video evidence, could take years. Was there any explanation as to why? No, except I have to say that the lady I spoke to was unbelievably nervous as I asked some fairly reasonable and very gentle questions. She did say that Mr. Vaz had not been suspended, and she was also happy to say the first police investigation had been dropped. But the important thing here is that even going to the government website, I was able to find some information because I knew that something was going on. But now enter 2018, so there was that web page. It's been replaced by this web page, and what's significant? Well, we have the same designator. We've got complaints and investigations, but on the original screen on the left we have names. On the screen on the right we just have the complaints process. So all these names disappear, and they've been whitewashed out, Mike. And the other thing is that the current inquiries bar has also disappeared from the government website. So the MPs clearly circling the wagons now to defend themselves when people come forward with allegations of sexual harassment or expenses fraud. Well, Mr. Vaz seems to be doing okay because the probe, not investigation, it's called a probe now, whatever that means, has already lasted 2 years, and nobody knows when this is going to be completed. Now, if we remind ourselves what happened, he stood down as chairman of the Commons Home Affairs Select Committee, looking at matters to do with Vice, after the Sunday Mirror reported he had discussed buying cocaine with a rent boy, a male prostitute. So the Parliamentary Standards Commissioner launched a probe into whether he was guilty of a conflict of interest because he'd been leading a review of Vice laws at the same time as the allegations. But that's a very difficult thing for them to establish, Mike, even with a video. So years have gone by and we've still not got any result, but now the whole thing has become totally secret. Now, something that was quite interesting was that the UK column had a report, and I'd say from a source that we would say was reliable, and in that report it was alleged that one or both of the rent boys who were apparently present at the incident with Mr. Vaz were attacked and badly beaten in Poland by persons as yet unknown. So that's the allegation, that those rent boys were attacked and beaten very badly in Poland, but there isn't at the moment any any evidence against who did it. That's what we are being told. We'll see whether we get more reports on that. So here we are, the report in The Sun. Police dropped their initial investigation into the Leicester East MP for 18 months ago. And the New Standards Commissioner, Catherine Stone, has told MPs she's referring the case back to the Met. But at the same time, we're apparently also looking into the fact people are not too sure where all his money is coming from. So what can we see? We can see our Parliament becoming increasingly secretive to the extent it's not even worth making an allegation because this will simply stay undercover and you have no idea whether any investigation takes place. So couple it with Cliff Richard, and we've pointed this out before, but basically as a result of incompetence or possibly a planned action by the BBC, we can now see the law rapidly moving towards a position where you cannot make any public allegations against anybody because this will come back on you in order to protect the identity of these individuals. So at least Ian Murray here, the Society of Editors, said it had worrying consequences for press freedom and the public's right to know. But of course, Tory MP Nigel Evans dismissed those concerns over press freedom, saying the journalists, are simply worried that they can't trash people's reputations. And that brings us nicely to the so-called independent child abuse inquiry, because in the last few days it's emerged that Prince Charles' lawyers have been arguing with the inquiry's legal team over the manner in which he produces evidence in relation to Bishop Bell, who was imprisoned as a result of sexual abuse. So we're not going to find out really what Prince Charles had got to say. But interestingly enough, one of the lawyers working for survivors said this: "We wish to register our surprise and concern that the Prince has chosen to put his evidence to the inquiry in the form of a letter, as opposed to a witness statement verified by a statement of truth in the normal way that survivors giving evidence to this inquiry have done." So one rule for the survivors, totally different one for Prince Charles. And he goes on to say concerns around Charles' letter include that it may be less than entirely frank about his personal relationship with Peter Ball, and that it contains matters to which he is reluctant to attach a formal statement of truth. And this lawyer, Richard Scorer, also retweeted this little report by a lady called Linda Woodhead. She said, ICSA today on the Peter Ball scandal hears of the extraordinary lengths to which Prince Charles' lawyers went to wriggle out of complying with ICSA's request that the Prince gives a witness statement to the inquiry like everyone else, even invoking European Convention on Human Rights. So obviously Charles desperate that he does not have to give evidence in the same way that survivors or members of the public would. Why would he be so shy? Well, this tweet was sent through to me, and I've got to say I think the gentleman's comments fit. So it's a Brian P. Wilmot, and he said any person who's not prepared to stand and tell the truth has something to hide, and it certainly seems that this is the case on this one, Mike. And perhaps this leads us nicely into Melanie Shaw, and let's remind ourselves that Melanie Shaw's local MP is a gentleman called Chris Leslie. Several people contacted me to point out that here was Mr. Leslie getting very excited about the standards in prison. So we're going back to January here, but he said, shocking urgent notification from Chief Inspector into fundamentally unsafe Nottingham prison, echoing concerns I raised in Commons debate last year. 8 suicides, 200 assaults in the past 6 months, 30% positive for drugs. New Lord Chancellor David Gauke must act now. But remarkable that this gentleman, Mike, doesn't want to act for Melanie Shaw, who's been brutalised by these very failings in other prisons.
And he was even her employer at one point.
Yeah, he was her employer at one point, and there is a photograph, we'll see whether we can produce that for the news tomorrow, where he sat, excuse me, next to her on a sofa holding her hand to show his level of support for child abuse victims. But it appears that, like many MPs, Chris Leslie is duplicitous when it comes to actions to protect Melanie Shaw. Now, I'd like just to have a look at this excellent letter that Robert Greene sent to Chris Leslie, and let's read through. Dear Mr. Leslie, I've contacted you, as many others over the years, about the disgraceful ongoing plight of your constituent Melanie Shaw. I do not propose to go through the details of this case, as I feel confident you have been fully informed about the state's unrelenting persecution of this poor defenceless and acknowledged victim of multiple sexual abuse, committed whilst in the supposed care of the Nottinghamshire authorities. Indeed, one local authority employee, Andres Loggins, has been convicted of multiple rapes committed at the very care home in which Melanie was placed and sentenced to 20 years imprisonment. His wife, Helen Loggins, another Nottingham Council social worker, has been convicted for aiding and abetting her husband. I and others have been in regular contact with Amnesty International, as the evidence suggests that Melanie, during her controversial imprisonment, has been the victim of torture administered by the UK state. The case is, I'm told, being currently considered by that international organisation. And we now know, due to recent revelations, that the British government is perfectly capable not only of being complicit in torture, but even prepared to publicly lie about it, as demonstrated by the misconduct of Jack Straw. At least one excuse, weak though it is, was that such torture was used on suspected foreign terrorists operating outside the United Kingdom. Melanie Shaw, on the other hand, is a Nottingham woman and UK national who's apparently been tortured in British prisons because of the evidence she is prepared to put before the Independent Child Abuse Inquiry in providing details of serious crimes committed at Beechwood Home that may implicate high-ranking public individuals, including, I understand, a person formerly a colleague of the current Prime Minister. As Melanie is clearly an absolutely crucial high-profile witness in the ICSA investigation into widespread child sexual abuse in the Nottingham area, I found it shocking that the inquiry has not already interviewed her, regardless of the incarceration that can only be explained rationally as a means of silencing her. I have therefore sent key details to the ICSA's current head, Professor Alexis Jay, and her deputy Liz Long. Her deputy Liz Long has written to me to confirm that these details have indeed been read by Professor Jay. There can now be no further excuse for the failure to interview Melanie, and he ends by saying, as her elected parliamentary representative, what are you going to do about it? Yours sincerely, Robert Greene. So a truly excellent letter from Robert, and I think this should provide a lead for many other people to write to Chris Leslie with that key question: what are you going to do to help Melanie Shaw? Chris Leslie. Well, if we remind ourselves that ICSA itself still refuses to take evidence from Melanie Shaw or even communicate with her, despite the fact that Melanie has said publicly she wants to speak to the inquiry, despite the fact that contact has been made with the inquiry on her behalf, including, it's alleged, by Mr. Leslie, Chris Leslie himself. ICSA says we can't act unless Melanie calls us, but of course Melanie can't call them because she's denied phone calls in prison. And we'll finish the section by reminding people, of course, of the untimely haste with which Beechwood Children's Home was sold off and demolished after Nottingham police failed to carry out a full and proper forensic investigation. And more recently, UK Column has informed people that the reports about Beechwood have been pulled from mainstream media sites and the BBC as a result of collaboration between Nottingham City and County Councils and Nottingham Police. So censoring of the news there, Mike, in order to help silence and cover up abuse of children. And I'll just come back to Robert here, because I think this was such a wonderful statement. Robert said this: "So Melanie Shaw is desperate to give evidence to ICSA, and it has so far refused to take it. Meanwhile, Prince Charles is desperate to avoid giving evidence to ICSA. What is going on?" Well, there can only be one answer. We're witnessing a cover-up by the British government. And if we come back to the inquiry itself, a very big thank you to the person who pointed this out to us. But the inquiry has commissioned this report. It's called A Rapid Evidence Assessment: What Can Be Learnt from Other Jurisdictions About Preventing and Responding to Child Sexual Abuse. And this is the University of Lancashire has been commissioned to carry out this piece of work by the so-called Independent Child Abuse Inquiry. What did they do? They looked at information on the internet, Mike.
Really?
Yeah. So we had these people: Lorraine Radford, Helen Richardson Foster, Christine Barter and Nikki Stanler. They carried out this work for the so-called Independent Abuse Inquiry. Fascinating report. Encourage people to see it online. Here's the executive summary. This rapid evidence assessment was commissioned by the Independent Inquiry into Child Sexual Abuse in England and Wales, which is investigating whether public bodies and other non-state institutions have taken seriously their duty of care for and protect children and young people from child sexual abuse and exploitation. The question for the review was: what can be learnt from jurisdictions outside of England and Wales about the role of institutions, including accountable state and non-state organisations, and responsibility for children in preventing and responding to child sexual abuse and exploitation? What they seem to have done here, Mike, is to produce the answers for a whitewash. No jurisdiction has everything right. Whilst overall robust research on what is effective is limited, there is plenty of promising evidence that can be developed further to inform work in England and Wales. So we got it wrong, but don't worry, because in the future we can put it right. Adequately resourced, comprehensive, multi-sector approaches that aim to prevent and respond to child sexual abuse and exploitation are likely to be the most effective approach. But these are the approaches that have failed. So we've got a nice circular argument. What's special about the research team? Well, I did a little bit of investigation, and I find by an amazing coincidence they're all linked to NSPCC. And in their own report, of course, they then use a lot of NSPCC information, saying how good NSPCC is at apparently stopping the abuse of children. But this is all independent, you understand.
And there's no possibility that the NSPCC could possibly be criticised by the Independent Inquiry if the Independent Inquiry were doing its job properly?
Yes. And we remember that it was NSPCC that was first of all taking phone calls, and there was such outrage amongst the abuse survivors and others that they had to drop the contract.
Right, so they were running the call centre for the Independent Inquiry at the beginning, and whereas many of the survivors were saying, well, hold on, the NSPCC was involved in the abuse, or at least helped cover it up in the past. So what are they doing, taking phone calls on this?
Yes, it's it's independent. This is what independence is about, Mike. But it gets better, because I did a little bit of research before the news today on ICSA's site. And here we've got their own documentation showing that in Rochdale, going back into 1974 to 89, we've got NSPCC taking over child protection from the local authorities. So seemingly here, NSPCC must be implicated in the very failings that the Independent Inquiry is now asking an NSPCC experienced team to report on.
Good stuff.
But it's not a cover-up. We'll end there. Thank you very much for joining us. We will be back at the same time tomorrow.
Hopefully without technical problems. Apologies for that once again.
Indeed.
Bye-bye.
Okay, bye-bye.